It's now my pleasure to introduce Katherine Arnold, who is going to be our final speaker. And Katherine has been Master of St Edmund's College, Cambridge since October 2019. She's also chair of the Fitzwilliam Museum Syndicate and of Cambridge Global Health Partners, and advises Faith Invest, a charity which empowers faiths to invest in line with their beliefs and values. Katherine has had an international career in the UK's diplomatic service, with postings in Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and Oman, and as ambassador to Mongolia. She currently leads the FCDO's CMI Certified Leadership Programme for those seeking promotion into the senior civil service, as well as leading CMI certified programs for police forces and apprentice schemes. Prior to joining the FCDO, Katherine was a journalist and travel writer in the Middle East. Her career started with leading global management consulting firm, Oliver Wyman. She has an MA and MPhil in theology from the University of Cambridge and an MA in religious conflict from Nottingham University. Katherine was awarded an OBE for services to British foreign policy and the 2019 New Year's Honours. And so I'm delighted to hand over to her.
Thank you very much indeed, Suzanne. The last slot of a day is always unenviable, and I also appear to be representing the entirety of the secular view of ethical leadership. Suzanne gave me some excellent advice, though, which was that I should speak from personal experience and anecdote rather than seeking to bring in a number of the secular models. And that was particularly good advice, given the eloquence with which we touched upon them in some of the talks already. I was very struck, for example, by what Adrian was saying about the similarity between Ignatius' view of leadership and Cotter, one of the models that I use quite often in the courses that I run. So what I'm going to try and do is a very quick canter through a few of the questions that I think leaders who are seeking to explore what being ethical means in the secular world, but I'm not wholly sure, again, as Adrian explored, whether there is really that much difference between a religious perception of this and a secular perception. Although I also take what Dame Laurentia was saying, and particularly looking at Alistair McIntyre, of what is an ethic in a world in which you may potentially atomize that down to the individual view of everything. So recognizing that any form of taxonomy is reductive and therefore hopefully triggering comment and critique, which we can explore later, I'm going to start out with where I tend to look when I'm doing sessions with young people who are deciding what career path they might wish to take. Because I think one of the things we need to ask ourselves when questioning ethical leadership is, what are we leading and for whom? And so when I very crudely am talking about the areas in which I have the most personal experience, so international relations of different varieties, I tend to divide the world into three very crude typologies of job. And every one of these three has a very clear overlap, but it's about where the priority of focus lies. And in this typology, there are organizations that are seeking to understand and inform on a state of being. So classic examples of that might be journalism or academia. There are organizations that are seeking to influence and change an aspect of being. And so classic organizations that would fall into that would be advocacy organizations, heads of campaigns, or indeed commentators within the media. And then there is a very large group of organizations which are seeking to manage and deliver an outcome. And those can range all the way from the civil service, politicians, charities, and indeed businesses. And if we focus particularly on that last category, I want to sort of pick up something that Charles mentioned earlier, which is, to what end are those organizations seeking to manage and deliver an outcome? And again, very crudely, I would argue that there are two types of organization. Those that are principally profit-driven, and I absolutely recognize that what constitutes profit can be open to analysis, but let's for now just assume that that is your classic financial bottom line. over what time frame, I agree, is open to interpretation. So you've got a group of organizations that are profit-led, and then a group of organizations that are purpose-driven. And this is where I think it's very interesting to pick up on some of the points that Dame Laurentia was making, particularly around productivity and the negative connotation that that can have, and indeed optimization. Because I would argue that although those can have very negative manifestations, particularly when you're looking at a purpose-driven organization, you could argue that those are very important. Because by increasing productivity, optimizing the system, you can arguably deliver more of that purpose. And I think I was very struck, and then there's another question of, ultimately, for whom are you delivering either that profit or that purpose? And I was very struck by Charles' anecdote around the organization which intended to be a campaigning organization for the homeless, but was in fact a home for campaigners. So that takes me back to actually where I started with, what are you leading and for whom are you leading it? And there I think it is very important, because there's another question for me implicit in the attempt to be an ethical leader, which is, where is that ethic focused? So, for example, John Adair has a very simple leadership model, which is that a good leader, crudely, focuses on the individual, focuses on the team, and focuses on the task. And there are many ways that this model is usually applied, but I actually think it can be very profound in our reflection of, what do we mean by being ethical? Are we focused on the ethic of the outcome we wish to achieve, the purpose of the organization? Are we being ethical in terms of how we lead that organization? So looking in, but looking in at the level of the entire organization. Or are we being ethical in our treatment of each individual within that organization? And I think this does raise some very profound questions. Let me give you an example. You're leading an organization which is a charity, and its charitable purpose is blindness in Vietnam, for example. A lot of people have given money for you to achieve that purpose. You have very limited resources, and a member of your staff has serially underperformed. You've given them training, you've given them support, but they are still not able or not willing to deliver at the level that might be expected. The consequence of that is that your purpose is not being delivered to the maximal extent possible, but also your wider team is quite often picking up that individual's work. That individual is, however, a single mother, and the sole breadwinner for her family. That is, I would argue, a classic ethical leadership dilemma. Because where is your ethic going to be focused? Is it focused on those who gave your charity money and on the charitable beneficiaries to which that money and that purpose should be directed, i.e., in this case, the blind in Vietnam? Is it focused on your wider team who are having to work extra hours, who aren't seeing their own family, who are suffering increased stress because of an individual's underperformance? Or is it focused on the realities of what will happen to that individual should you actually remove them from the organization? There are other examples as well, and I think it's particularly interesting to look at some of the examples when you start moving across different cultural frameworks. We live in a society that is very focused on contract, on regulation, and obviously we will hopefully hear from Eilish, perhaps in more detail, some of the issues that we might look at through that legal framework within the UK and in cultures similar to our own. But not all cultures focus on a contract based at the top of the hierarchy of potential underpinnings of one's ethic. Many societies will much more focus on community, authentic leadership, servant leadership, etc. Ethical leadership is sometimes seen as slightly more structuralist, because to some extent, one version of ethical leadership is about creating the frameworks and the accountability mechanisms to align organizations behind a series of ethical values. And I think this leads me on to another area I just want to touch on with ethic, and indeed how you frame an organization in order to ideally align it behind a positive purpose and a positive set of values, however conceived, which is to reflect a little bit on jeopardy. When I joined the Foreign Office in my mid-20s, it was at a period shortly before the global crisis. And then we got to the global crisis, and there was an awful lot of talk, a financial crisis, we're talking about 2008. There was an awful lot of talk about bad practice within business, scandals within business, a lack of ethical leadership, which has led to a lot of this theory that I'm talking about the accountability mechanisms and the frameworks that you actually need within an organization in order to align people behind values as well as profit or purpose. But in that discourse, and I don't want to make too gendered a point of this, but in that discourse was a very strong sense that one of the things that might have gone wrong was that there were too many young men who were too eager to take risk. And that therefore, one of the challenges that had happened was very risky behavior had become the norm without thinking through the consequences of those risks that those people were taking. And it struck me as very interesting moving into the Foreign Office from having been in the city, and I recognized that behavior at the start of my career. Because what I saw was when we were trying to take truly bold and brave decisions, which could have had arguably a very positive but potentially risky approach within the Foreign Office, what I noticed was the more senior and the older the senior member of staff who was taking the decision, the more risky they were prepared to be, or the bolder, if you want to use another word. And that actually what was happening was young men and women of the age which had been pointed to within the global financial crisis of having been out of control because of their risk appetite were actually the most likely to take the most risk-averse decisions. So this sent me on a long course of reflection and discussion with various people. And actually at heart, it was, I think, really quite simple, because all of us are constantly taking a cost-benefit analysis. And whereas in the case of the city, the system had been optimized to say, you're probably not going to stay within this organization very long anyway, but within this very short time frame, if you take a risky decision, which has a very good profit upside for the organization, we will give you extraordinarily large bonuses. On the other side, the same group of similarly aged and otherwise identical individuals had a completely different cost-benefit analysis. They were not particularly well paid, but actually the benefit to them was security and stability within a career that they could potentially stay in until they were 65, 67, 68. So actually, they were far more likely, the further away they were from retirement, and therefore the more career that they had to consider, to take a risky decision, because it was much more sensible to play safe. And so I think that's me just saying that behind a lot of how we behave within an organization are where the organization has placed the incentives. And I think this is perhaps partly at heart of the ethical leadership debate. I was very struck at a seminar a couple of nights ago at St. Edmund's, which was being run by the von Hugel Institute, which is our Institute of Catholic Critical Inquiry, and the Wolf Institute, which focuses principally on the Abrahamic faiths, in a discussion around forgiveness. And a question was coming up repeatedly, which is it easier to forgive if you believe in forgiveness or indeed justice in the hereafter? Or is it easier to forgive if you believe that the here and now is all there is? And I think that that is in some ways a question that we should all be asking when we're looking at concepts of ethical leadership. So back to my young men or women who are taking risky or unrisky decisions. I would argue that to some extent, how they were incentivized to behave was to a large extent to do with incentive structures and accountability. And I think this is, again, where many organizations are increasingly having value propositions, mission statements. I mean, it all sounds very cheesy and we might rebel against it, but there is a very profound organizational purpose behind it. Because if you have a value statement up front, it is much easier then to say to your members, to your staff, to those who benefit from your services, this is who we are and this is what we stand for. So we're not going to force you to behave this way if you don't actually believe in it, because we're not forcing you to work with us, benefit from us, or be a member of us. But it can be very powerful as a leadership tool to say, no, actually, if we have a value of mercy, a value of tolerance, a value, choose your value, if you're not behaving in that way, then this is not the right organization for you. It enables, again, an accountability, but it also enables people to attract others who share the same vision, which again can be extremely powerful within an organization. But there I think we reach one of the nubs of these problems, which is that is not very easy at scale. And I think we've seen this an awful lot with large multinational corporations in recent years. The big names, the big brands may say that they have a mission, may say that they have a set of values, but do they actually have, does that feel authentic and does it feel credible, whether to us as consumers or beneficiaries of their action, or indeed to their staff internally, which I think is where we have seen that dissonance between mapping up a series of coherent values at scale is precisely why we can see more of that value alignment and an easier model of ethical leadership in smaller organizations than when we're talking about major multinational corporations, governments, or indeed, as perhaps Gemma has been discussing, some of the discussions within the church. There's a lovely example that I often use here, because also we've got to allow that these organizations are tracking through time, and that ethics, as perceived by humans, does change through time and space and culture. And that's the example of the strapline of the New York Times, which is all the news that's fit to print. In one of the most powerful Twitter chains I've ever seen, which does demonstrate that you can genuinely put across a message in 140 characters, as long as you can put more than one set together, was the observation that when you looked at the walkout at the New York Times and some of the debates over media and how the New York Times ought to be presenting itself, was at the heart of an intergenerational difference over that very strapline, all the news that's fit to print. Because those who are over the age of 40 and self-identified perhaps as liberal journalists or liberal-minded journalists would still focus on all the news that's fit to print. Whereas those who are under the age of 40, who also self-identified as liberal-minded New York Times journalists, put the emphasis elsewhere, all the news that's fit to print. So the same tagline, but seen in a very, very different perspective, potentially by people from different generations. And so I think that brings me to another question to pose, which are, what are the limits of our responsibility? And what are the limits of our authority? And this begins to speak back to what I was saying about size and complexity within an organization. And I think this is where the challenge becomes real if one wants to live and be an ethical leader. And there are two examples that I think come very powerfully from the international relations sphere: intervention and international development. And by intervention, I'm principally looking at hard intervention, military intervention, and international development as perhaps softer intervention. What are the limits of responsibility and what are the limits of authority? We will all have views on what has happened in Afghanistan. We will all have looked at the last 20 years of interventionist foreign policy and have drawn a number of conclusions. But I think if we go from that macro to a micro, there are very few people who, when seeing an axe-wielding murderer about to kill a group of children, if they could act, who wouldn't. So if we scale up that example, where do we stop? Where are the limits of responsibility and where are the limits of authority? On international development, I think there is an absolutely fascinating case study around the decisions around the Development Act in the early part of this century, where in law, the UK enshrined the fact that international development should not be tethered to foreign policy. This was a secular visioning of a profoundly, I would argue, Christian or religious narrative. And of course, with the merger of the Foreign Office and DFID, we have seen an unwinding of that. But I think it is a very, very interesting case of a state attempting to deliver charity out with its own self-interest. But that actually raises very profoundly philosophical questions. Does a state whose money comes from its citizens have a right to say that its citizens' money will not be spent in their interest? And I think that takes me back, perhaps, and I recognize that I do not want to dwell on sort of the biblical understanding too much, because there are far more experts in the room than I have. But as somebody who has spent most of my career pondering these large questions about limits of responsibility and limits of authority, I often come back to Pontius Pilate. What is truth? For me, that is the cry of an administrator confounded by complexity. And then also, render unto Caesar what is due unto Caesar, and unto God what is due unto God. There was a very specific moment in which Jesus said those words, but how far do we render unto Caesar, and when do we need to render unto God? So thus far I am going to conclude very rapidly. Thus far, I focused a lot on systems, processes, incentivization mechanisms. It's all very head and not particularly heart. But I think that ethical leadership is actually an exercise in the management of complexity. And at a certain point, we are simply incapable of processing any more complexity. And we do begin to flip from the head to the heart. And this is where I think it's very interesting to look at systems analysis and sort of the dynamics of systems, where there is a point where you have to have more and more of a certain effect taking place before you reach a tipping point. You go over the tipping point and you reach a new point of stability before the process begins to repeat itself. And for me, that is very important. There is the process where you need to be analysing the situation, gathering more data, listening to more people, but at a point at which you actually reach a tipping point, which is not head-driven, it's heart-driven. And that is a point at which you are at peace with the decision that you are taking. I don't think that you can remain in that state for long before the process restarts, but I think as a leader, being at peace with the decisions that you have taken and the responsibilities that you bear is actually profoundly important. Because we do need to have the confidence to stand up for what we believe, the humility to recognize that we could be wrong, and the wisdom to learn when you have been wrong. And so you've listened, you've looked at the options, you've listened, and you have reflected. But at some point, you have to be at peace with the limit of your responsibility and the limit of your authority. And if there's one final practice that I would like to share with you that I think can be very profoundly powerful, particularly when responsible for organizations that are so large and will have such profound consequences on so many, that there will never have been a right judgment and a right decision. It's to focus on those who will suffer as a consequence of the decision that you are going to take. Having genuinely and authentically reflected upon that, can you live with that? And perhaps as importantly, are you adequately clear of the purpose to which you are taking that decision, that you will live for that decision? And so I'm going to end actually with, at St. Edmund's, I don't know how many of you know, we were founded in 1896 after the Test Acts as a house for Roman Catholics who were newly entering the University of Cambridge. Now we are a secular full member college of the University of Cambridge, but we remain the only full college in Oxford and Cambridge with a Roman Catholic dean and chapel. And at our matriculation and at our admission of fellows, the dean always gives the same blessing. But there's a phrase in the middle of it, which to me speaks absolutely to what I think we could all agree on as a fundamental tenet of ethical leadership. And the wonderful thing about it is it speaks to our 80 different nationalities that we have in the college. We're one of the most international in Cambridge, people from all faiths and none, as well as this very specific Roman Catholic background that we come from. And the phrase is this, and I will leave you when I finish it. May we be delivered from fear before truth, complacency before half-truth, and pride that would claim all truth. Thank you very much.